we shall not be moved. We shall not be moved like a tree.
Hi, I'm Mr. Loomis. Welcome back for our second lesson about the Civil Rights Movement. Today we're going to be telling some of the most famous stories this time in history. Stories which you probably know a little about already. Like the Montgomery bus boycott and Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech. I challenge you today to go beyond the surface level of these stories, to understand them within the context of the time. What was happening at that moment? How did these events relate to the other things happening at that moment? How did one thing lead to another? Before we get started, let's preview our topics. We'll begin with Rosa Parks, Dr. King, and the famous Montgomery bus boycott. Then we'll talk about the strategies the civil rights movement leaders employed, including the ideas of nonviolence and civil disobedience. We'll talk about some of the other famous protests, including the sit-ins, freedom rides, and the campaigns in Albany and Birmingham. We'll describe how the I Have a Dream speech, We will describe the I Have a Dream speech and how it's connected to the Civil Rights Act. And we'll finish today with the movement for voting rights that included Freedom Summer, the Selma March, and culminated with the passage of the Voting Rights Act. Let's get started. On a cold December evening in 1955, just a year after the Supreme Court had said that segregated schools were illegal, Rosa Parks started a revolution by sitting down. She was tired after spending the day working at a department store. When she stepped onto the bus for the ride home, she sat in the fifth row, the first row of the colored section. In Montgomery, Alabama, when a bus became full, the seats closest to the front were given to white passengers. The bus driver told Parks and 3 other African Americans to move to the back of the bus. 3 riders did what he said, but Parks did not. Because Parks refused to move, she was arrested and had to pay $10. The arrest of one woman for violating the city's bus seating rules would have probably been forgotten. But this time was different, because Parks and leaders in Montgomery's African American community were fed up with the Jim Crow laws of the South and had planned for her to be arrested. They wanted to get people to fight for racial equality and needed a clear example of the unfairness of the Jim Crow system. The arrest of a hard-working woman for sitting where she wanted on the bus proved to be just what they needed to make African Americans upset enough to do something about the problem. The leader of the protest was a little-known minister named Martin Luther King Jr. King had been raised in an activist family. His father had been involved in Marcus Garvey's Back to Africa movement in the 1920s, and his mother was the daughter of one of Atlanta's most important African-American ministers. As a student, King did very well. He easily moved through the grade levels and went to Morehouse College at the age of 15. He went on to attend seminary, where he studied to be a Christian minister. While studying for his doctorate degree at Boston University, he met and married Coretta Scott. After receiving his PhD in 1955, King became the minister of the Dexter Street Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. During his time studying, King read the works of Henry David Thoreau and Mohandas Gandhi of India. They said that the right way to make change was to use civil disobedience and nonviolence. They taught that illegal laws should be broken and that fighting by peacefully protesting could show the world that on one side of an argument there was right, while on the other side there was evil and violence. King and his friend Ralph Abernathy organized a nonviolent boycott of the Montgomery city buses. The boycott was simple. The city's African Americans would not ride the buses until the bus company agreed to let them sit anywhere. Until that happened, the company would lose money as their passengers walked. Both sides thought the boycott would be short. King and the other leaders thought the company would quickly give up instead of losing money. and the white city leaders thought that no one could get all the city's African Americans to walk everywhere for more than a day or two. The boycott's leaders had hoped for 50% of the city's African Americans to join the boycott. To their surprise, 99% of the city's African Americans refused to ride the bus. People walked to work or rode their bikes. Carpools were set up to help older people. The bus company lost a lot of money. Montgomery leaders stopped at nothing to try to end the boycott. King and Abernathy were arrested. 4 African American churches, as well as the homes of King and Abernathy, were bombed. Still, the boycott continued. Finally, on November 23, 1956, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the boycott. Segregated busing was declared unconstitutional or illegal. City officials agreed to obey the court's decision. Dr. King and his followers in Montgomery had proven that non-violent protest could work. Montgomery bus boycott led to similar events in the South and other cities. The boycott made Martin Luther King Jr. famous all over the country, and people looked to him to lead the civil rights movement. With Ralph Abernathy, King started the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, to organize other nonviolent protests against Jim Crow segregation. SCLC wasn't the only group organizing nonviolent protests. Students were an important part of the civil rights movement also. Let's take a look at one of their stories. On February 1st, 1960, 4 African American students from the North Carolina Agricultural Technical College in Greensboro went to their local Woolworths and sat at the lunch counter. The restaurant refused to serve them, which the students knew would happen, since Woolworths only served whites. If African Americans wanted a meal, they had to order and take their food out from the back of the store. However, this time, instead of leaving, the students stayed and waited. The people who took part in the Woolworth sit-ins were determined. Their plan was simple: sit quietly and wait to be served. Often, the students who joined in the sit-ins would be made fun of and threatened by local white customers. Sometimes whites would throw food or ketchup at them. Angry onlookers tried to start fights. In the event of a physical attack, the students would curl up into a ball on the floor and take the punishment. Any violence would go against the idea of a peaceful sit-in. When the local police came to arrest the protesters, another line of students would take the empty seats. After 6 months of sit-ins, Woolworth's owners gave in and desegregated their lunch counters. As the students had guessed, they just did not want the negative publicity. The successful Greensboro sit-in was the start of students participating in the civil rights movement, and within 2 months, the sit-in movement had spread to 54 cities in 9 states. In the words of grassroots civil rights leader Ella Baker, the students at Woolworths wanted more than a hamburger. They wanted to be part of the struggle for equality. She helped start the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, or SNCC. The sit-ins inspired other forms of nonviolent protests where public places were segregated. Sleep-ins happened in motel lobbies. Read-ins filled public libraries. Wade-ins happened at public pools and beaches. And churches became the sites of pray-ins. Students also took part in the 1961 Freedom Rides, organized by the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, and SNCC. In the 1960s, most people still traveled between cities by bus. And the Supreme Court had decided that segregation was illegal on interstate buses and waiting rooms in bus terminals. But in the South, white leaders were ignoring the court's decision. The Freedom Rides were meant to get people to realize this so that they would force the bus companies to integrate. Leaving Washington, D.C., the riders headed south. Sometimes whites rode in the back while African Americans rode in the front, and at other times riders of different races would share the same bench seat. The Freedom Riders did not have too many problems until they reached South Carolina, where a mob attacked John Lewis, a Freedom Rider who later became chairman of SNCC and eventually a congressman. The danger increased as the riders continued through Georgia into Alabama, where one of the 2 buses was firebombed. The second group continued to Birmingham, where the riders were attacked by the Ku Klux Klan as they got off the bus at the city bus station. The last Freedom Riders continued to Mississippi, where they were arrested when they tried to desegregate, the waiting rooms in the Jackson bus terminal. Even though the Freedom Riders had to deal with a lot of violence, they were successful in achieving their goal. They got the federal government's attention. In September of 1961, the Interstate Commerce Commission stepped in and issued new rules. White and colored signs came down in the terminals. Racially segregated drinking fountains, toilets, and waiting rooms were now desegregated. Because of their success in Montgomery and the Freedom Rides, student leaders from SNCC and Dr. King and the SCLC got together to try to desegregate the city of Albany, Georgia. There were problems from the start. The students and the older leaders from SCLC did not always agree on strategy. Dr. King was jailed, as were hundreds of other protesters, and progress was slow. The white police chief in Albany sent protesters to jails across the South so that his own would not become too full. It was hard to get the attention of newspapers and television reporters because the city leaders tried not to use violence against the protesters. Eventually, the protest organizers gave up. Some thought the Albany movement was a failure, but historian Howard Zinn, who was at the protests in Albany, disagrees with this idea. He wrote, "Social movements may have many defeats, failing to achieve objectives in the short term. But in the course of the struggle, the strength of the old order begins to break down. The minds of people begin to change. The protesters were defeated for a short time, but not crushed, and have been lifted, heartened by their ability to fight back." In fact, the Albany movement did make a difference. Civil rights leaders used what they learned in Albany as they planned later civil rights protests. In 1963, SCLC went to Birmingham, the largest city in Alabama. Led by Dr. King, the protests started peacefully but turned violent when the city's white police force attacked the marchers. In the end, the city government was forced to change to end the city's Jim Crow laws. Unlike the earlier work in Albany, which focused on desegregating the entire city, Dr. King and the civil rights leaders focused on more specific goals. They wanted to desegregate Birmingham's downtown stores. They wanted an equal chance to be hired to work in downtown stores and for the city government. They wanted to be able to go to the city parks, and they wanted to be a part of a committee to help desegregate Birmingham's public schools. The city's police safety commissioner, Bull Connor, used police dogs and fire hoses on the young marchers. This was captured by television cameras and showed how violent the white city leaders were compared to the peaceful, nonviolent civil disobedience of the African American protesters. While in jail in Birmingham, King wrote one of the most important letters of the civil rights era. Because of the violent reactions of the white policemen of the city, some African American leaders had criticized King, telling him to stop taking direct action that led to whites attacking marchers. Also, many whites were openly angry that King had come to their city at all. He was an outsider, they said. In response, King wrote an open letter answering each of these criticisms. His letter from a Birmingham jail included one of King's most quoted lines: "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." It was his job, he wrote, to help people when they asked him to lead their fight for justice, no matter where they were. And King asked if waiting would ever make discrimination go away. He argued that the violent response of whites was not a reason to wait, since waiting would not change the way people thought and felt about segregation. After weeks of peaceful protest, the Birmingham campaign led to a good result. In June 1963, the Jim Crow laws in Birmingham were repealed and the whites-only signs were taken down. However, there was still some violence. 4 months after, someone bombed the house of NCAA attorney Arthur Scholes, injuring his wife. In September, the KKK bombed the Birmingham 16th Street Baptist Church on a Sunday morning and killed 4 young girls. Also that year, NAACP lawyer Medgar Evers, who had helped James Meredith become the first African American to enroll at the University of Mississippi, was shot and killed outside his home in Jackson, Mississippi. He'd been organizing protests like those in Birmingham. After the Birmingham campaign, the SCLC made plans for a large march in Washington, D.C. to show Congress how many people wanted new civil rights laws to end segregation. This was the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, and about 200,000 to 300,000 people joined in. It was held in August 1963 on the 100th anniversary of Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, and the speakers talked to the crowd from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial with the statue of the great president behind them. The date was also the 8th anniversary of the murder of Emmett Till. The highlight of the march was Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous I Have a Dream speech, in which he talked about the dreams of the civil rights movement based on two great documents, the Old Testament of the Bible and the Declaration of Independence. Quoting from the Declaration, King reminded Americans that the Founding Fathers had written, "All men are created equal," on July 4th, 1776. And that if the promise was going to be true for everyone, the country would have to do the hard work to end racism. The march marked a high point of the civil rights movement and explained the goals of the movement for everyone in the country. However, it did not stop white terrorism or end white supremacy. The March on Washington did succeed in its main goal of getting the government to pass a new law. After the march, President John F. Kennedy gave his own civil rights speech and asked Congress to pass a new law to end Jim Crow segregation. After Kennedy was killed, President Lyndon Johnson worked to get Congress to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This ended discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, and is still important today. It also ended racial segregation in schools, at the workplace, and in places that are open to the public, like restaurants, stores, and hotels. With the passage of the Civil Rights Act, civil rights leaders turned their attention to the next important problem, voting. Elected leaders must do things to help voters, or the voters will pick someone else in the next election. Jim Crow laws had long stopped African Americans from being able to vote. If African Americans could vote, civil rights leaders knew that they would be able to bring about change without having to march in the streets, because the elected leaders would want to win their votes. In the past, whites had used violence or threats to stop African Americans from voting or even registering to vote in the South. For example, African Americans who went to vote might lose their jobs or be attacked. In the summer of 1964, a group made up of the four major civil rights organizations, the NAACP, SCLC, SNCC, and CORE, arranged for volunteers from all over America to come and register as many African Americans in Mississippi to vote as possible. They knew that if many people all registered to vote at once, the threats from groups like the KKK would lose their power. This event became known as Freedom Summer and was one of the most important times in the civil rights movement. Many of Mississippi's white people did not like the outsiders who came to help register African Americans to vote. White people harassed the volunteers who came to help with Freedom Summer. Newspapers called them unshaven and unwashed trash. State and city governments, police, white citizens councils, and the Ku Klux Klan would used arrests, arsons, beatings, evictions, firings, murder, spying, and other forms of bullying and harassment to show their dislike for the project. Over the course of the 10-week project, 1,062 volunteers were arrested, 80 were attacked, 37 churches were bombed or burned, 30 homes or businesses were bombed or burned, and at least 4 civil rights workers were murdered. On June 21st, 1964, James Chaney, an African American, as well as 2 Jewish white volunteers from New York City, Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner, were kidnapped and killed by members of the KKK. Their murder, and the search and discovery that the local white police had helped the KKK with the murders, caused newspapers around the country to write about Freedom Summer. President Johnson sent the FBI to search for the bodies of the murdered volunteers. During the search, white-run Mississippi newspapers said that the disappearance was made up to draw attention. But the search of rivers and swamps turned up the bodies of 8 other African Americans who'd been murdered. Though Freedom Summer failed to register many voters, it did lead to an important result. It helped end the Jim Crow system. Before Freedom Summer, big newspapers and television networks had not reported the attacks on African American voters in the Deep South and the dangers faced by civil rights workers. Sadly, it took the deaths of white volunteers from the North to make the news media notice. After Freedom Summer, the leaders of the movement decided to fight for voting rights in Selma, Alabama. Nonviolent marchers demanded the right to vote, and the police responded by arresting protesters. Again, the jails filled up. Many of the marchers were students, and again, King and Abernathy were arrested. After an Alabama state police officer shot and killed Jimmy Lee Jackson during a voting rights protest, close to 600 protesters tried to march from Selma to Montgomery, the state capital, to meet with Governor George Wallace. Led by Reverend Hosea Williams of the SCLC and John Lewis of the SNCC, the marchers were attacked by state police and sheriffs who used tear gas, clubs, and bullwhips when they tried to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge on a day remembered as Bloody Sunday. Amelia Boynton, who had helped organize the march as well as marching in it, was beaten unconscious. A photograph of her lying on the road appeared on the front page of newspapers and news magazines around the world. In all, 17 marchers were hospitalized, and 50 more were hurt by police. People watching the march on television, and who saw how the police attacked the marchers, started to support the Selma voting rights campaign. Finally, a federal judge ordered Alabama to allow the march to Montgomery. In the end, about 25,000 protesters marched to the steps of the Alabama Capitol, where King spoke about the need for voting rights. Public pressure grew, and within 5 months, Congress and President Lyndon Johnson passed a new law to end discrimination at the voting booth. The result of the Selma movement was not that leaders in Alabama changed their laws, but that the federal government in Washington, D.C. passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It ended racial discrimination in voting. The law ended literacy tests, poll taxes, and sent observers to watch elections and make sure African Americans were allowed to register to vote. That concludes today's lesson. Before we go, let's recap our big ideas. African Americans in the city of Montgomery, Alabama, boycotted the city bus system for over a year to end segregated seating on the buses. Martin Luther King Jr. became famous as the leader of the boycott. Dr. King believed in nonviolence and civil disobedience. He founded SCLC to organize more protests. Other groups, such as SNCC and CORE, also were started by students and also used nonviolence and civil disobedience. Many protests across the South were led by these groups. Student sit-ins at lunch counters, the Freedom Rides, and the Albany and Birmingham campaigns were all met with violence by whites. Some of these protests were successful at ending Jim Crow segregation laws, and some not. In 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. gave the I Have a Dream speech in Washington, D.C. He described a future for the United States when segregation and racism had been eliminated. The march convinced Congress to pass the Civil Rights Act. In 1964 and 1965, Freedom Summer and the Selma March were efforts to win voting rights. Whites in the South responded violently to both, and finally President Johnson and Congress passed the Voting Rights Act. I'll see you next time when we talk about the later part of the Civil Rights Movement, a story that's often overlooked in history classes because it's less heroic, less glamorous, and less satisfying and more violent. But it is a part of the story that is key to understanding where we are as a country today. I'll see you then.
Like a tree that's planted by the water.